summer of '63, and the Shoshone wilderness felt like the tail end of the earth. I was 24, green and aching everywhere, trying to keep pace with Hicks, who moved through the dense scrub and shale like he was born to it. Hicks was all sinew and stubble, smelling perpetually of stale pipe smoke and wet wool. His ranger uniform faded to the color of dry moss. We were 3 weeks into a mapping detail near the northern boundary, checking elevations and driving stakes. A job so isolated the only official contact we had was a brief, crackly radio transmission every 4 days confirming we hadn't been eaten by grizzlies yet. The work was brutal, climbing 10,000 feet just to mark a line, the air thin and cold even at midday, the sun feeling closer and harsher than it should. We settled into a rhythm defined by the clang of the axe and the monotonous counting of paces. Dinner was always canned corned beef hash cooked over the butane stove, tasting metallic and unsatisfying. The silence up there wasn't peaceful. It was a physical pressure, heavy enough to make your ears ring, broken only by the sharp, echoing snap of a dry branch far off, or Hicks clearing his throat like a file grating wood. Hicks, being a local, sometimes spoke of the old mountain men, not the romantic types, but the paranoid ones who lived alone for 30 years and never came down. They talked about the thing that walked the high passes, the one that mimicked sounds, the thing they never saw but always knew was paralleling their tracks, just outside the radius of the campfire light. We'd smirk at the whiskey-soaked superstitions, calling it the high-altitude headache effect. But after the second week, the headache started feeling real. Our supplies, cached under a sheet of plywood near the river bend, were always undisturbed, but the heavy, pungent smell lingered nearby. Not bear, not deer, something musky and strangely clean, like raw earth and ozone. I noticed small things. My heavy steel canteen, which I swore I had placed upright on the stump, was always lying on its side, slightly indented, as if stepped on by something massive but flexible. Hicks was quieter than usual, too. He started sleeping with his .30-06 resting across his chest, something he never did unless the snow was deep and the elk were desperate. We were near the base of Sentinel Ridge, where the pines give way to crumbling granite scree. We needed to confirm a century-old survey marker, supposedly buried deep in a shallow stream bed. The stream was low, nothing but dark, slick stones now. That's when we saw it. Not the marker, but the mouth of something else entirely. Hidden behind a tight curtain of chokecherry bushes and thick, matted ferns, was a break in the rock face. It wasn't a natural cave. The opening was too perfectly semicircular, the edges smoothed and blackened as if heat or friction had worked them down over centuries. It smelled faintly of sulfur and stale air, and it was barely wide enough for a man to slip through sideways. Hicks knelt down, dragging a heavy glove across the dust covering the stone lip. He looked up at me, the fading afternoon light catching the sweat on his brow, and his breath hitched, a wet, shallow sound, as he whispered that the entrance wasn't marked on any old maps, and he knew damn well that opening hadn't been there when he ran this exact grid 3 years prior. It looked freshly excavated, like a huge animal had clawed its way out, or something much worse had bored its way in. I backed up, kicking loose gravel, my heart rate ticking up a notch just looking at the dark oval that seemed to be actively sucking the light out of the late afternoon. The air hadn't just cooled with the setting sun. It dropped heavy, instantly, the kind of cold that feels wet and smells faintly of crushed stone and ozone, like after a nearby lightning strike. We were high up, in the rough country where the pines start to thin out, but normally there'd be the insistent buzz of flies, maybe a hawk circling, or the frantic click of cicadas fighting the heat. Now, nothing. The silence wasn't restful. It was heavy, pressing on my eardrums. I remember consciously swallowing to equalize the pressure. That's how deafening the quiet was. Even the slight breeze that had been kicking up dust all day seemed to die right at the edge of that hole. We spent a full 30 minutes documenting the edges, Hicks running his heavily gloved hand over the strange, glassy, smooth scrape marks that definitely weren't natural erosion. They looked polished, almost slick. Hicks was muttering about fissures and subterranean steam erosion, trying desperately to use textbook geology to explain the impossible sight in front of us, but his voice lacked conviction. He kept glancing nervously into the impenetrable darkness below. He pulled out his flashlight, a heavy military-grade aluminum tube, and aimed the beam down. It cut a clean cone for maybe 20 feet before the light seemed to just dissolve, absorbed by the blackness itself. It wasn't just a deep shaft, it was a hungry darkness. Then it happened. It wasn't a snap of a dry branch or the natural whistle of wind tunneling through the granite. It was a rhythmic thump. It came from inside the hole, low and deep, resonating up through the dense rock like the slow, heavy beat of a massive drum heard miles away through water. It was too regular to be natural settling and too soft for a collapse. Hicks froze completely, his hand still resting against the cold, jagged edge of the entrance, his breathing gone completely ragged now. I tried to be the rational one. I had to be. We were exhausted, running on weak coffee and trail mix, and the altitude was playing tricks on our perception. Relax, Hicks. Settling stone, I said, trying to put volume and authority in my voice. Old mine shaft collapsing further down, maybe. The pressure shifts with the cold. I hoped I sounded convincing. I said it loud, trying to drown out the metallic echo the sound had left in my skull. He didn't look at me. He was staring past me, towards the tree line where the shadows were thickening into solid black ink. And for a terrifying second, I thought I saw a shift in the gloom, something too tall and too dark to be a shadow cast by the fading light. Hicks finally whispered, his voice dry as sandpaper. That wasn't settling. That was movement. That was pacing. Hicks's eyes were too wide, reflecting the last sliver of the dying campfire. I wanted to tell him he was hearing things, that the thin mountain air carried sounds funny, but a sharp, dry snap, not a twig, but something heavy cracking under pressure, cut my denial short. It came from exactly where he was looking. We scrambled back into the tent, dragging the rifles, the heavy canvas offering the illusion of safety that neither of us believed in. That first night was pure auditory torture. Not screams, not roars, just methodical, crushing steps circling the perimeter, always just outside the ring of light, coupled with a deep, shuddering inhalation that smelled vaguely of wet pine needles and ozone, pressed right up against the nylon wall. We didn't talk about it the next morning. We packed in a punishing silence, the coffee tasting like ash and resentment. Hicks was useless, jumpy, cleaning his M1903 repeatedly until the bore gleamed unnecessarily bright, ignoring the dirt in his own fingernails. By the third night, nestled deeper into the valley near the little sandy creek, the tension was a physical weight, pressing us down. We were drinking too much of the stale whiskey rations and sniping at each other over trivial things, the placement of the cooking skillet, the volume of the crackling radio static. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I didn't see darkness. I saw the vague outline of something too large standing still just beyond the threshold of my sight. It started subtly around 2 a.m., right after the moon completely dipped behind the peaks. A dragging sound. It wasn't the wind moving branches. This was heavy, deliberate, like a rough sack being pulled across granite, dragging slowly around our camp. Then came the scratching, not on the ground, but on the wood of our main supply crate, a slow, insistent scrape, scrape, scrape right next to Hicks's head. It wasn't claws, it sounded harder, sharper, like a jagged piece of bone or rock being used to test the integrity of the barrier between us. Hicks started whimpering, low and breathy, clutching his rifle so hard his knuckles turned the color of bleached limestone. The worst was the breathing. It shifted from outside the tent to sounding like it was inside my own head. And then, the imitation. A sound that mimicked a human sigh, deep and tired, followed by a wet, clicking noise, like a tongue struggling to form words. It was attempting to communicate. It was trying to sound like us. I rolled over, sweat cold on my chest despite the heavy blankets. Hicks wasn't breathing normally. He was just lying there, eyes wide open, pointing the rifle muzzle towards the peak of the tent, utterly unresponsive. "It knows our names," he whispered, his voice thin and sharp, cracking on the consonants. I heard it earlier. Not in English, but the shape of them. The intent. It knows what we are. I tried to touch his arm, to pull him back to reality, but he flinched away violently. His paranoia had curdled into something religious and terrifying. He spent the rest of the night mumbling about offerings and leaving salted meat on the trail, convinced that if we just gave up certain things, maybe it would let us pass. He had crossed a line, and I realized, shivering, that I was now trapped in the wilderness, not just it. The morning arrived with a layer of heavy, suffocating dew. The air was colder than it had any right to be in late summer, and I felt the chill deep in my bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. Jared was quiet, unnervingly so. He didn't speak of the offering. He just grabbed his rifle and started walking toward where he'd left the salted venison package, his eyes wide and vacant like glass marbles. I followed, holding my breath. We found the spot 20 yards from the camp. The meat wasn't just gone. The entire thick canvas bag we had sealed it in was shredded, not neatly torn, but pulled apart violently. The ground beneath the spruce where he'd placed it looked like someone had dropped a boulder. The earth was cratered, and the sparse mountain foliage was flattened in radial lines radiating outward from a single center point. But what made my blood seize and turn to ice was the smell, a sickening, heavy musk that wasn't bear and wasn't elk. It was damp, fetid, and carried a sharp tang, like an old garbage fire mixed with wet dog hair. "It took the offering," Jared whispered, his voice dangerously soft. "It accepted." I ignored him, my gaze fixed on a stand of young pines 50 feet away. They were too tall for normal deer or even a large grizzly to affect, but 3 of the trunks, each at least 4 inches thick, were snapped cleanly in half, 20 feet up. They hadn't fallen. They had been twisted and broken, fibers ripped wetly apart, lying angled like broken bones. No animal, short of an elephant, possessed the strength to do that, and we were 5 days' travel from the nearest civilization. Then the shadow moved. It wasn't a quick movement, but a slow displacement of air, an impossible shift of volume deep within the treeline, where the shadows were thickest. It was tall. God, it was impossibly tall. It didn't look like an animal. It looked like a seam of pure, moving darkness, denser than the air around it. It stood behind the mangled pines, and I could feel the sheer weight of it, pressing down on the atmosphere, making the cold air feel heavy and liquid. I couldn't scream. My throat had closed tight, replaced by the bitter, metallic taste of panic. My vision narrowed, focusing only on the thing that should not exist. I saw the flash of an eye, not reflecting light, but absorbing it, deep-set, large, and possessing a terrifying, ancient intelligence that saw right through the meager shield of my existence. It wasn't looking at us with hunger or aggression. It was looking with the profound, indifferent boredom one might give an insect crushed underfoot. Jared made a low, guttural noise beside me, not a sound of fear, but of absolute, crushing defeat. He didn't lift his gun. He just dropped it. The sound of the rifle hitting the damp earth lost completely in the ringing silence that enveloped us. I knew, with sickening certainty that shattered every rational thought I had ever possessed, that we were never meant to see this. We were not part of this world's equation. We had stumbled into a place where the rules of man and nature did not apply, and the thing watching us knew exactly how insignificant we were. The sheer impossibility of its size, its casual destruction, the absolute, undeniable proof standing right there in the Wyoming wilds. It broke me. The monster didn't have to attack. Seeing it was the attack, and we were already defeated. The paralysis shattered like brittle ice. We were defeated, yes, but the primitive, snarling core of my brain didn't care about philosophical loss. It screamed run. Miller was already scrambling, his movements jerky and panicked, a man caught in a waking nightmare, trying to access reality by sheer force. I grabbed the back of his jacket, shoving him toward the rusty Ford pickup. We fell inside the cab, slamming the thin doors shut. They sounded like tin cans closing against the immense, crushing silence of the woods. I jammed the key into the ignition. Nothing. Just a miserable, clicking protest from the solenoid. Come on, you son of a bitch, I hissed, cranking the key again, praying to a god I hadn't believed in since I was 10. The engine coughed, a dry, metallic wheeze, and died immediately. The air outside thickened. I didn't need to see it to know it was moving. The forest, which had been silent minutes ago, now registered the deliberate, earth-shaking tread of something impossibly heavy. Thump, thump. Each step was punctuated by the wet, explosive crack of thick pine branches being snapped casually beneath feet that must have been the size of car hoods. Miller was weeping, a high, strangled sound that tasted like bile in the claustrophobic air of the cab. He fumbled with his rifle, but his hands were shaking too badly to chamber around. I turned the key a third time, holding it steady, forcing the dying battery to respond. The starter screamed, a high, whining shriek that felt deafeningly loud, a beacon advertising our presence in the deep dark. And then, miraculously, the engine sputtered, caught, and roared into life, a sputtering, uneven victory. Drive, drive, Miller yelled, shoving the rifle onto the dashboard. I stomped the clutch and threw the shifter into reverse, but it was too late. The shadow fell over the cab, obliterating the weak glow of the dash lights. The smell that hit me was not of pine or musk, but something chemical and hot, like stale ammonia mixed with wet dog and ozone. It was right there. I heard the sound of wood splintering, followed by a noise I will never forget, the sound of reinforced sheet metal tearing like wet paper. The passenger side of the truck exploded inward. One moment, Miller was screaming, strapped into his seat next to me, his face a mask of terror. The next, the entire door, and Miller with it, was gone. The cold night air blasted into the cab, carrying with it a spray of warm, metallic liquid that hit my face and neck. It wasn't coolant. I didn't look. I couldn't look. The sheer, empty space where Miller had been was the most terrifying sight of all. It was an absence, a sudden, horrifying lack of human presence. My foot slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The truck bucked violently, tires spinning on the loose gravel, coolant steaming from the ruptured firewall. I wrenched the steering wheel, turning sharply away from the massive, dark shape that was still standing where the truck had been moments before. We were now airborne, launching off the primitive dirt track and plunging into the dense undergrowth. Branches scraped and shrieked along the truck's remaining flank, sounding like claws trying to pull me back. I drove blind, relying on the high beams to show me only a few feet ahead of the speeding metal coffin. The fear was gone, replaced by a pure, blinding jolt of adrenaline that tasted like rust. I didn't know where I was going, only that the empty, ruined passenger seat beside me meant I had to drive until the engine seized, or until the sun came up, whichever came first. Behind me, the colossal thing didn't immediately follow. It didn't need to chase. It had made its point. It had taken its offering. And I was driving away from the sound of Miller's muffled, final scream, which echoed not in the woods, but permanently inside the ringing chambers of my own skull. The only thing I registered was the terrible, empty wind rushing in through the space where the door had been, carrying the last vestige of the Wyoming wild into my lungs. I drove until the sun came up, until the smell of pine was replaced by exhaust fumes, and the first sign I saw wasn't a warning marker, but a gas station sign promising bad coffee and lukewarm hot dogs. I crashed the truck into the curb outside the small sheriff's office in Pinedale. The front bumper crumpled, the door dangling uselessly. My uniform was torn, soaked in Miller's blood, or maybe some of my own, I couldn't tell. My hands were locked on the steering wheel, white-knuckled and useless, years after the fact. They stitched me up, gave me sedatives, and asked questions. Weeks of questions. They found the remains of the cabin, or what was left after the fire and what the winter hadn't claimed, but they didn't find Miller or anyone else, not even scraps. My description of it, the height, the smell of ozone and rot, the way the ground shook when it moved, sounded insane even to my own ears when I said it aloud in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room. They called it a severe psychological break exacerbated by isolation and trauma. They mentioned an aggressive bear, an extremely large specimen perhaps, or a rogue mountain lion. They said I had invented the thing to cope with the failure to save my partner. They took my badge. They filed the report under unexplained incidents/traumatic stress syndrome. Of the 4 other rangers who went into those peaks that autumn, 2 simply vanished before the first snow, their last radio communication being nothing but static and a sound like breaking stone. The third, Corporal Jennings, was found 6 months later, 30 miles off course, squatting by a frozen stream near the border of the reservation. He didn't speak a single comprehensible word ever again, only a high-pitched, wet clicking sound whenever a shadow moved too fast across his periphery. He's institutionalized now, the light gone from his eyes. I visit him sometimes. We share a silence thicker and colder than the pines we escaped. I live far from Wyoming now, where the mountains are just small, civilized hills and the night air doesn't hold that specific, ancient cold. But I never sleep soundly. Every sudden gust of wind against the window pane, every deep-throated howl from a distant certainty of a man who has looked into the abyss and heard it breathe, that the empty tracts of this country are not just woods and rock. They are the hunting grounds of something impossibly old and impossibly hungry. It only let me leave to carry the message. I check the locks twice a night, every night, because the mountains are still out there, and that thing is still listening. And sometimes, when the wind changes, I can still smell the wet fur and the metallic musk of